Professor von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 5. The Problem of the Motorboat. Captain Hank Barber, master mariner, gripped to the bow rail of the Lydian and peered off through the semi-fog into the early morning of the dark streak flashing along through the gray-green waters. It was a motorboat of long, graceful lines, and a singular figure, that of a man, sat upright at her helm, staring uncompromisingly ahead. She nosed through a roller, staggered a little, righted herself, and sped on as a sheet of spray swept over her. The helmsman sat motionless, heedless of the stinging splash of wind-driven water in his face. "She's sure going some," remarked Captain Hank reflectively. "By Ginger, she keeps up into Boston Harbor, she won't stop on this side of the public gardens." Captain Hank watched the boat curiously until she was swallowed up, lost in the mist, then turned to his own affairs. He was a couple of miles out from Boston Harbor going in. It was 6 o'clock in a gray morning. A few minutes after the disappearance of the motorboat, Captain Hank's attention was attracted by the hoarse shriek of a whistle 200 yards away. He dimly traced through the mist the gigantic lines of a great vessel. It seemed to be a ship of war. It was only a few minutes after Captain Hanks lost sight of the motorboat that she was sighted again. This time she flashed into Boston Harbor at full speed. She fled past, almost under the prow of the pilot boat, bound out, and was hailed. At the mess table later, the pilot's man on watch made a remark about her. "Going? Well, she wasn't, though. Never saw one thing pass so close to another in my life without scrubbing the paint off of it. She was so close up I could touch her, and when I spoke to her, the feller didn't even look up. She just kept on a-going. I told him a few things that was good for his soul." Inside Boston Harbor, the motorboat performed a miracle. Pursuing a course which was singularly erratic and at speed more than dangerous, she reeled through the surge of the sea, regardless the lack of fog, the proximity of other vessels, and a heavy wash upon larger craft. She was narrowly missed by a tug. There she skimmed by a slow-moving tramp, and warning shout was raised. A fisherman swore at her, as only a fisherman can. And finally, when she passed into a clear space, headed for a dock at top speed, she was most unanimously condemned craft that ever came into Boston Harbor. "Yes, that's a boat," remarked the aged salt facetiously, as he gazed at her from the dock. "If that fool don't take up some speed often, and hers go right through all right, wharf and all." Still, the man in the boat made no motion. The whiz of her motor, plainly heard in a sudden silence, was undiminished. Suddenly the tumult of warning was renewed. Only a chance would prevent a smash. Then Big John Dawson appeared on the string piece of the dock. Big John had a voice that was noted from Newfoundland to Norfolk for its depth and width, and possessed objectory powers which at once the awe and admiration of the fishing fleet. "You idiot!" bellowed the impressive helmsman. "Shut off that power! You'll throw a helium!" There was no response. The boat came on directly toward the dock where Big John and his fellows were gathered. The fishermen and loungers saw that a crash was coming and scattered from the string piece. "You stupid fool!" said Big John resignedly. And then came the crash, the rending of timbers, the silence gave for the grinding whir of the motor. Big John ran to the end of the wharf and peered down. The speed of the motor had half-driven the boat halfway up onto the float, which careened perilously. The man had been thrown forward and lay huddled up, face downward and motionless on the float. The dirty water lapped at him greedily. Big John shinnied down to the float, crept cautiously to the huddled figure, and turned it up faceward. He gazed for an instant at the wide, staring eyes, then turned from the curious ones peering down from the dock. "Well, no wonder he didn't stop," he said in an odd tone. "The fool is dead." Willing hands gave aid, and after a minute the lifeless figure lay on the dock. It was that of a man in uniform, apparently the uniform of a foreign navy. He seemed about 45 years old, large and powerful of frame, with a sun-browned face of a seaman. The jet black of the mustache and goatee were startling against the dead color of the face. The hair was tinged with gray, and on the back of the left hand was a single letter, D, tattooed in blue. "Oh, he's French," said Big John authoritatively, "and that's the uniform of a French naval captain." He looked puzzled a moment as he stared at the figure. "And there ain't been a French man-o'-war in Boston Harbor for 6 months. After a while the police came, and with Detective Mallory, a big man of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and finally Dr. Clow, medical examiner. While the detective questioned the fishermen and those who had witnessed the crash, Dr. Clow examined the body. "An autopsy will be necessary," he announced as he rose. "How long has he been dead?" asked the detective. 8 or 10 hours, I should say. The cause of death doesn't appear. There is no shot or knife wound, so far as I can see." Detective Mallory closely examined the dead man's clothing. There was no name or tailor mark. The linen was new. The name of the maker of the shoes had been cut out with a knife. There was nothing in his pockets, not a piece of paper, nor even a vagrant coin. Then Detective Mallory turned his attention to the boat. Both hull and motor were of French manufacture. Long, deep scratches on each side showed the name had been removed. Inside the boat, the detective saw something white and picked it up. It was a handkerchief, a lady's handkerchief, with the initials EMB in the corner. "A woman's in it," soliloquized the detective. Then the body was removed and carefully secluded from the prying eyes of the press. Thus, no picture of the dead man appeared. Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, and others asked many questions. Detective Mallory hinted vaguely at international questions. The dead man was a French officer, he said, and there might be something back of it. "I can't tell you all of it," he said wisely, "but my theory is complete. It is murder. The victim was a captain of a French man-o'-war. His body was placed in a motorboat, possibly a part of the fittings of the warship, and the boat was set adrift. I can say no more." "Your theory is complete, then?" Hatch remarked casually. "Except the name of the man, the matter of death, the motive of the name of the ship, and the presence of the handkerchief, and the precise reason why the body should be disposed of in this fashion, instead of being cast into the sea." The detective snorted. Hatch went away and made some inquiries of his own account. Within half a dozen hours, he had satisfied himself by telegraph that no French man-of-war craft had been within 500 miles of Boston for 6 months. Thus, the mystery grew deeper. 1,000 questions to which he seemed. It was this point, the day following that the events related, that the problem of the motorboat came to the attention of Professor von Dusen, the world's foremost analytical brain. The scientist listened interestedly, but petulantly, to the story Hatch told. "Has there been an autopsy yet?" he asked at last. "It is set for 11 o'clock today," replied the reporter. "It is now after 10. "I shall attend it," said the scientist. Medical examiner Clow welcomed the eminent Professor von Dusen proffered of assistance in the capacity of MD, while Hatch and other reporters In 2 hours, the autopsy had been completed. Professor von Dusen amused himself by studying the insignia of the dead man's uniform, leaving it to Dr. Clow to make the startling statements to the press. The man had not been murdered. He had died of heart failure. There was no poison in the stomach, nor was there a knife or pistol wound. Then the inquisitive press poured on the flood of questions. Who had scratched off the name of the boat? Dr. Lecloud didn't know. Why had it been scratched off? Still, he didn't know. How did it happen that the name of the maker of the shoes had been cut out? He shrugged his shoulders. What did the handkerchief have to do with it? Really, he couldn't conjecture. Was there any inkling to the dead man's identity? Not so far as he knew. Any scar on the body which might lead to an identification? No. Hatch made a few mental comments on the officials in general, and skillfully steered the professor away from the other reporters. Did the man die of a heart failure? He asked flatly. No, he did not, was a curt reply. It was poison. But the medical examiner specifically stated that there was no poison in his stomach, persisted the reporter. The scientist did not reply. Hatch struggled with and suppressed the desire to ask more questions. On reaching home, the professor's first act was to consult the encyclopedia. After several minutes, he turned to the reporter. Of course, the idea of natural death in this case is absurd, he said shortly. Every fact is against it. Now, Mr. Hatch, please get me all the local New York papers for the day the body was found, not the day after. Send or bring them to me, then come again at 5 this afternoon. But, Hatch blurted. I can say nothing until I know the facts, interrupted Von Dusen. Hatch personally delivered the specified newspapers into the hands of the professor, this man who never read newspapers, and went away. It was an afternoon of agony, an agony of impatience. Promptly at 5 o'clock, he was ushered into Professor Von Dusen's laboratory. He sat half smothered in newspapers and popped out of the heap aggressively. It was murder, Mr. Hatch, he exclaimed suddenly. Murder by an extraordinary method. Who was the man? How was he killed? Hatch. His name is... The scientist began, then paused. I presume your office has the book Who's Who in America. Please phone and ask them to give you the record of Langham Dudley. Is he the dead man? Hatch demanded quickly. I don't know, was the reply. Hatch went to the telephone. 10 minutes later, he returned to find the professor dressed to go out. Langham Dudley is a ship owner, 51 years old, the reporter read from notes he had taken. He was once a sailor before the mast and later became a ship owner in a small way. He was successful in his small undertakings and for 15 years has been a millionaire. He has a certain social position, partly by the aid of his wife, whom he married a year ago. She is Eden Marson Bedling, the daughter of a famous bedding company. He has an estate on the North Shore. Very good. Now we will find out something about how this man was killed. At North Station, they took a train for the small place on the North Shore, 35 miles from Boston. There, Professor Von Dusen made some inquiries, and finally they entered a lumbersome vehicle and drove off. After a drive of half an hour through the dark, they saw the lights of what seemed to be a pretentious country place. Somewhere off to the right, Hatch heard the roar of the restless ocean. Wait for us, commanded Von Dusen. He ascended the steps, followed by Hatch, and rang. After a minute or so, the door was opened, and the light flooded out. Standing before them was a Japanese, a man of indeterminate age with the graven face of his race. I hate doing accents. He has not the pleasure, replied the Japanese, and Hatch smiled and queerly turned phrase. Mrs. Dudley? Asked the scientist. Mrs. Dudley is attiring this. If you will be pleased to enter. Professor Von Dusen handed him a card and was shown to the reception room. The Japanese placed chairs for them with a courteous precision and disappeared. After a short pause, there was a rustle of silken skirts on the stairs, and a woman, Mrs. Dudley, entered. She was not pretty. She was stunning, rather. Tall, of superb figure, and crowned with a glory of black hair. Mr. Van Dusen? She asked as she glanced at the card. The professor bowed low, albeit awkwardly. Mrs. Dudley sank down on the couch, and the two men resumed their seats. There was a little pause. Mrs. Dudley broke the silence at last. Well, Mr. Van Dusen, if you... she began. You have not seen the paper for several days, asked the professor abruptly. No, she replied wonderingly, almost smiling. Why? Can you tell me just where your husband is? He squinted at her with that aggressive way which was habitual. A quick flush crept into her face and grew deeper at the sharp scrutiny. The inquiry lay in her eyes. I don't know, she replied at last. In Boston, I presume. You haven't seen him since the night of the ball? No, I think it was 1:30 that night. Is his motorboat here? I really don't know. I presume it is. May I ask the purpose of this questioning? The professor continued to squint at her for half a minute. Hatch was uncomfortable, even half resentful, at the sharp, cold tone of his companion. On the night of the ball, the scientist went on, pressing the question, Mr. Dudley cut his left arm just above the wrist. It was only a slight wound. A piece of court plaster was put on it. Do you know if he put it on himself? If not, who did? I put it on, replied Miss Dudley, unhesitatingly, wonderingly. And whose court plaster was it? Mine. I had some in my dressing room. Why? The scientist rose and paced across the floor, glancing out at the hall door. Miss Dudley looked at Hatch inquiringly, and was about to speak when the professor was stopped beside her and placed his slim fingers on her wrist. She did not resent the action, was only curious, if one might judge from her eyes. Are you prepared for a shock? The scientist asked. What is it? Your husband is dead, murdered, poisoned, said the scientist with sudden brutality. His fingers lay on her pulse. The court plaster which you just put on his arm, and which came from your room, was covered with a virulent poison which is instantly transfused into his blood. Mrs. Dudley did not start or scream. Instead, she stared up at the professor a moment. Her face became pallid. Then a little shiver passed over her. Then she fell back on the couch in a dead faint. Good, remarked Van Dusen complacently. And then, as Hatch started up, suddenly, shut that door! The reporter did so. When he turned back, his companion was leaning over the unconscious woman. After a moment, he left her and went to the window where he stood looking out. As Hatch watched, he saw the color returning back to Mrs. Dudley's face. At last she opened her eyes. Don't get hysterical, Professor Van Dusen directed calmly. I know you had nothing whatsoever to do with your husband's death. I only want a little assistance to find out who killed him. Oh, my God, exclaimed Miss Dudley. Dead? Dead? Suddenly, tears leapt from her eyes, and for several minutes the two men respected her grief. Raised her face. Her eyes were red, but there was a rigid expression about her mouth. If I could be of any service, she began. Is this the boathouse I see from the window? Asked the professor irritably. How long, low building with the light over the door? Yes, replied Mrs. Dudley. You say you don't know if the motorboat is there now? No, I don't. Will you tell your Japanese servants, and if he doesn't know, let him go down and see, please? Mrs. Dudley arose and touched the electric button. After a moment, the Japanese appeared at the door. Osaka, do you know if Mr. Dudley's motorboat is in the boathouse? She asked. No, honorable lady. Will you find out, please? Go yourself and see. Osaka bowed low and left the room. closing the door gently behind him. The professor again crossed to the window and sat down, staring out into the night. Mrs. Dudley asked questions, scored of them, and he answered them in order until she knew the details of the finding of her husband's body, that is, the details the public knew. She was interrupted by the appearance of Osaka. "I do not find the motorboat in the house, honorable lady."
"That is all,"
said the scientist. Again, Osaka bowed and retired.
"Now, Mrs. Dudley," resumed the professor, almost gently, "we know your husband wore a French naval costume at your masked ball. May I ask what you wore?"
"It was a Queen Elizabeth costume," answered Mrs. Dudley. "Very heavy, with a long train."
"And if you could let me see a photo of Mr. Dudley."
Mrs. Dudley left the room, returning immediately with a cabinet photograph. Hatch and the scientist looked at it together. It was unmistakably the man from the motorboat.
"You can do nothing yourself,"
said the professor at last, and he moved as if to go.
"Within a few hours we shall have the guilty person. You may rest assured that your name will be in no way brought into this unpleasant matter."
Hatch glanced at his companion. He thought he detected a sinister note of a soothing voice, but the face expressed nothing. Mrs. Dudley ushered them into the hall. Osaka stood at the front door. They passed out, and the door closed behind them. Hatch started down the steps, but the professor stopped at the door and tramped up and down. The reporter turned back in astonishment. In the dim, reflected light, he saw the scientist's finger raised, enjoining the silence. Then he saw himself lean forward with his ear pressed to the door. After a little, he rapped gently. The door was opened by Osaka, who obeyed the beckoning motion of the scientist's hand and came out. Silently, he was led to the veranda and to the yard. He appeared in no way surprised.
"Your master, Mr. Dudley, has been murdered," said the professor quietly to Osaka. "We know that Mrs. Dudley killed him,"
he went on, and Hatch stared at him in sudden amazement.
"But I have told her that she is not suspected. We are not officers and cannot arrest her. Can you go with us to Boston without the knowledge of anyone here and tell what you know about the quarrel between husband and wife to the police?"
Osaka looked placidly into the eager face. "I had the honor to believe that the circumstances would not be recognized," he said finally. "Since you know, I will go."
"We will drive down a little way and wait for you."
The Japanese disappeared into the house again. Hatch was too astounded to speak, but followed the professor into the car. It drove away 100 yards and stopped. After a few minutes, an impalpable shadow came toward them through the night. The scientist peered out as it came up.
"Osaka?"
he asked softly.
"Yes."
An hour later, the three men were on the train, Boston bound. Once comfortably settled, the scientist turned to the Japanese.
"Now, if you will please tell me what happened on the night of the ball," he asked, "and the incidents leading up to the disagreements between Mr. and Mrs. Dudley."
"He drank elaborately," Osaka explained reluctantly in his quaint English, "and when drinking he was brutal to the honorable lady. Twice with my own eyes I saw him strike her, once in Japan, where I entered his service while they were on their wedding journey, and once here. On the night of the ball he was immeasurably intoxicated, and when he went dancing he fell down to the floor. The honorable lady was chagrined and angry. She had been angry before. There was some quarrel which I am not comprehensive of. They had been widely divergent for several months. It was, of course, not prominent in the presence of others."
"And the cut on his arm where the court plaster was applied," said the scientist. "Just how did he get that?"
"It was when he fell down," continued the Japanese. "He reached to embrace the carved chair, and the carved wood cut his arm. I assisted him to his feet, and the honorable lady sent me to her room to get court plaster. I acquired it for her dressing table, and she placed it on the cot.
That makes the evidence against her absolutely conclusive, remarked the professor, as if finally.
There was a little pause, and then,
Do you happen to know just how Mr. Dudley placed the body in the boat?
I have not the honor of knowing how she did it, said Osaka. Indeed, I am not comprehensive of anything that happened after the court plaster was put on, except that Mr. Dudley was affected some way and went out of the house. Mrs. Dudley, too, was not in the ballroom for many minutes or so afterwards. Hutchinson Hatch stared frankly into the face of the professor. There's nothing to be read there. Still deeply thoughtful, Hatch heard the brakeman call, "Bosun!" and mechanically followed the scientist and Osaka out of the station to the cab. They were driven immediately to police headquarters. Detective Mallory was just about to go home when they entered the office.
"It may enlighten you, Mr. Mallory," announced the scientist coldly, "to know that the man in the motorboat was not a French naval officer who died of natural causes. It was Langham Dudley, a millionaire shipowner. He was murdered. It just so happens that I know the person who did it."
The detective arose in astonishment and stared at the slight figure before him inquiringly. He knew the man too well to dispute any assertion he might make. "Who's the murderer?" he asked. The professor closed the door, and the spring lock clicked.
"That man there,"
he said calmly, turning to Osaka. For one brief instant there was a pause and silence. Then the detective advanced upon the Japanese with hand outstretched. The agile Osaka leapt suddenly as a snake strikes. There was a quick, fierce struggle, and Detective Mallory sprawled out on the floor. There had been a twist of wrist, a trick of jiu-jitsu, and Osaka had flung himself at the locked door. As he fumbled there, Hatch, deliberately and without compunction, raised the chair and brought it down on his head. Osaka sank to the ground without a sound. It was an hour before they brought him around. Meanwhile, the detective had patted and petted half a dozen suddenly acquired bruises, and had then searched Osaka. He found nothing to interest him save a small bottle. He uncorked it and started to smell it. Then the professor snatched it away.
"You fool! That'll kill you!"
he exclaimed. Osaka sat, lashed hand and foot to the chair in Detective Mallory's office, so placed by the detective for safekeeping. His face was no longer emotionless. There was fear and treachery and cunning there. So he listened perforce to the statement of the case of the professor, who leaned back in his chair, squinting steadily upward with his long, slender fingers pressed together.
2 and 2 make 4, not sometimes, but all the time,"
he began at last, as if disputing some previous assertion.
"As the figure 2, wholly disconnected from any other, gives small indication as a result, so it is isolated fact that's of little consequence. Yet that fact added to another, and the resulting fact added to a third, and so on, will give a final result. That result, if every fact is considered, must be correct. Thus, any problem may be solved by logic. Logic is inevitable. In this case, the facts, considering singly, might have been compatible with either natural death, suicide, or murder. Considered together, they proved murder. The climax of this proof was the removal of the maker's name from the dead man's shoes, and the fact strongly contributory was the attempt to destroy the identity of the boat. A subtle mind lay back in all of it."
"So I regarded it," said Detective Mallory. "I was confident the murder until the medical examiner—"
"We proved the murder,"
the professor went on serenely.
"The method? I was with Dr. Clow in the autopsy. There was no shot or knife wound, no poison in the stomach. Knowing there was a murder, I sought further. Then I found the method in a slight, jagged wound on the left arm. It had been covered with court plaster. The heart slowed constriction without apparent cause, and while Dr. Clow examined it, I took off the court plaster. Its odor, an unusual one, told me that the poison had been transfused into the blood through the wound. So 2 and 2 had made 4.
Then,
what poison? A knowledge of botany aided me. I recognized faintly the trace of an odor of an herb which is not only indigenous to, but grows exclusively in Japan. thus a Japanese poison. Virulent but necessarily slow and acts the cause does not be placed directly on an artery. The poison on the court plaster and that you took from Osaka are identical.
The scientist uncorked the bottle and permitted a single drop of the green liquid to fall on his handkerchief. He allowed it a minute or two for evaporation, then handed it to Detective Mallory, who sniffed at it with respectful distance. Then the professor produced a bit of the court plaster he had taken from the dead man's arm, and again the detective sniffed.
The same,
the scientist resumed, as he touched the lighted match to the handkerchief and watched it crumble to ashes.
And so powerful that in its pure state the mere inhalation is fatal. I permitted Dr. Clue to make public his opinion, heart failure, after the autopsy for obvious reasons. It would reassure the murderer, for instance, if he saw it printed, and besides, Dudley did die of a heart failure. The poison caused it. Next came identification. Mr. Hatch learned that no French warship had been within 100 miles of Boston for months. The one seen by Captain Boyer might have been one of our own. This man was supposed to be a French naval officer, and had been dead less than 8 hours. Obviously, he did not come from a ship of his own country. Then from where? I know nothing of uniforms, yet I examined the insignia on the arms and shoulders closely, after which I consulted my encyclopedia. I learned that while the uniform was French and any more thing else, it was really the uniform of no country. Because it was not correct, the insignias were mixed. Then what? There were several possibilities. A fancy dress ball seemed probable. Absolute accuracy would not be essential there. Where had there been a fancy dress ball? I trusted to the newspapers to tell me that. They did. A short dispatch from the place on the North Shore showed me that on the night before, a man was found dead there had been a fancy dress ball at the Ledley Dudley estate. Now it is necessary to remember every fact in solving a problem as it is to consider every figure in arithmetic. Dudley. There was a D tattooed on the dead man's hand. Who's Who showed that Langham Dudley married Elizabeth Marston Belling. There was a EMB on the handkerchief in the boat. Langham Dudley was a shipowner, had been a sailor, and was a millionaire.
Detective Mallory was staring into the eyes of the professor in frank admiration. Osaka, to whom the narrative had thus far been impersonal, gazed as if fascinated. Hudson Hatch, reporter, was drinking every word greedily.
We went to the Dudley place.
The scientist resumed after a moment.
This Japanese opened the door. Japanese poison. 2 and 2 were still making 4. But I was first interested in Mrs. Dudley. She showed no agitation, and told me frankly that she placed a court plaster on her husband's arm, and that it came from her room. There was an instant doubt that her connection to the murder. Her immediate frankness aroused it. Finally, with my hand on her pulse, which was normal, I told her the brutality that her husband had been murdered. Her pulse jumped fretfully, and as I related the cause of death, it wavered, weakened, and then she fainted. Now, if she had known her husband was dead, even if she had killed him, a mere statement that he was dead would not have caused the pulse. Further, I doubt that if she could have disposed of her husband's body in the motorboat. He was a large man, and she did not a powerful woman. And against the manner of her dress, even against it, therefore would presume her innocence. And then, the Japanese Osaka here. I could see the door of the boathouse from the room where we were. Mrs. Dudley asked Osaka if Mr. Dudley's boat was in the house. He said he didn't know. Then she sent him to see. He returned and said the boat was not there. Yet he had not gone into the boathouse at all. Ergo, he knew the boat was not there. He may have learned it from another servant. Still, it was a point against him.
Again, the scientist paused and squinted at that Japanese. For a moment, Osaka withstood the gaze. Then his beady eyes shifted, and he moved uncomfortably.
I tricked Osaka into coming here by the ludicrous simple expedient.
The professor went on steadily.
On the train, I asked if he knew how Mrs. Dudley got the body of her husband to the boat. Remember, at this point he was not supposed to know that the body had been in the boat at all. He said he didn't know, and by that very answer admitted that he knew the body had been placed in the boat. He knew because he had put it there himself. He put the poison on the court plaster when he went to get it. He didn't throw the body into the water because he had the sense enough to know if the tide didn't make it out, it would rise. After the slight injury, Mr. Dudley evidently wandered toward the boathouse. The poison was working, and perhaps he fell. When this man removed all identifying marks, even to the name of the shoes, he put the body in the boat and turned it on full power. He had a right to assume that the boat would be lost, or that the dead man would be thrown out. Wind and tide and a loose rudder brought it into Boston Harbor. I do not attempt to account for the presence of Mrs. Dudley's handkerchief in the boat. It might have gotten there in any one of 100 ways.
How did they know the husband and wife quarreled? Asked Hutch.
Surmised to account for her not knowing he was there, replied the professor. If they had had a violent disagreement, it was possible that he would have gone away without telling her, and she would not have been particularly worried, at least up to the time we saw her. As it was, she presumed he was in Boston. Perhaps Osaka gave her that impression.
The professor stared at the Japanese curiously.
Is that correct?
He asked. Osaka did not answer. And the motive? Asked Detective Mallory at last.
Will you tell us why you killed Mr. Dudley?
Asked the professor to the Japanese. I will not, exclaimed Osaka suddenly. It was the first time he had spoken.
It probably had to do with the girl in Japan, explained the professor easily. The murder has been a long-cherished project, such as one revenge as one would love to have inspired.
It was a day or so later that Hutchinson Hutch called to inform Professor von Dusen that Osaka had confessed and had given his motive for the murder. It was not a nice story. One of the most astounding things to me, Hutch added, is the complete case of circumstantial evidence against Mrs. Dudley, beginning with a quarrel and leading to the application of the poison over her own hands. I believe she could not have been convicted on such actual circumstantial evidence had you not shown conclusively that Osaka did it.
Circumstantial fiddlesticks, snapped the professor. I wouldn't convict a yellow dog of stealing jam on circumstantial evidence alone, even if it had been the jam all over its nose.
He squinted intrusively at Hatch for a moment.
In the first place, well-behaved dogs don't eat jam,
he added, more mildly.